warm welcome to Peter.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. How's everyone feeling? Woo! Having a good conference?
Yay!
Thank you so much for having me over in Groningen. I'm really honored to speak here. I was asked by the organizers to tell you something about GraphQL, and I was thinking about how I was going to do it. And I thought, well, maybe I can sort of combine it a little bit with my passions as well. So I'm an avid photographer, as maybe some of you have seen my pictures that I took at Frontiers. So you see plenty of my photography there. I'm also big into electronic music, but I won't bore you with that. You can view it on my website somewhere. So I just briefly wanted to tell that I run a digital product studio in Amsterdam, along with 3 other partners and 21 designers and lovely engineers. And we've done plenty of projects, actually, with people from Groningen as well. So I know, are there people here that have studied that actually visited Groningen? No one? Okay, a couple of hands, that's good. So we did a project with them. The Factor E, is it? Are they over here? Yeah, I see some hands over there. Return, also a company from near Groningen. We're doing a project with them right now. And of course Spindle, there must be people from Spindle in home, right? Yeah, that's good. Alright, so I've got some friends over there as well, so coming to Groningen feels like coming home a little bit as well. So thank you for having me. Now let's get into the talk. GraphQL, the future of APIs is here. Alright, so imagine, in a world far, far away, where the seas and shores are rough for ships and their cargo alike. While in other moments it can be peaceful and clear. I want to take you to a world where the likes of these roam and wander. But more about them later. So if you take a left on this lovely beach, and you take a right when you get to these rocks of basalt, then you get to this magical place. It's a place of hope and wonder. It's a place right there at the bottom of the mountain. You can see this little red house over there. And it's a fine small business. It's an academy of sorts. It's a place where great knowledge can be acquired. Magic spells, living in the forest, everything. So it's a place where you have this trifecta of courses that are being given. You have scholars coming there to acquire new skills and to follow these courses. And of course you have some teachers, like Vasilis, who actually give these courses. And when the business was small, of course it was very easy. People just came over into the village and they met up. But as the business was growing and growing, there was a need for something bigger. There was a need for some systems, some more structure, so even more scholars could get their courses there. And of course this has to be manifested. And so the business sent forth its most digital of kin on this road of digitalization to acquire the magic services that were needed to run this business. Introducing Leolis, marksman, keen of eye, and the owner of product. Leolis had collected many a magic service in the town square, a pamphlet of sorts, an application form, a scroll where people could fill in their skull. Also a ledger of coin to see which of the scholars actually paid for their course and which ones didn't and had to be asked later. And of course a collection of heralds that would go out into the towns and see if and spread the word about the courses that need to be given. And so business went well, but the demands from the scholars and the people involved they increased over time. And Leolis got asked over and over again, we want all of the data, all at once, and combined into a single golden interface. And Leolis was worried. He said, how are we ever going to merge all these worlds of data together into a single interface of gold? What would it even look like? He had no idea. He had no clue. Well, I'll find another magic service for this, I'm sure, like an all-in-one off-the-shelf solution. But of course, you would never find it. Well, he did not know yet, so he went looking far and wide. And in his search, Leolus went from the mountains to the plains, into the forests, where he stumbled upon a village, behind this good old tree on the left side. He found a little toadstool house. It was larger than life, where he met the kindest and loveliest woman named Amber. Amber was a druid, a shapeshifter, and a front-end developer. Well, Amber said, I know exactly the interface you need. And she started crafting this interface. And now, some say that it was the most elegant, most pure, and the best suited interface to the users that was ever created. Some say it was even crafted as if it was crafted by Mother Nature herself. And some say, actually looked more like this. So there was some status on the left side, there was some information about the students on the top side, and there was some top due payments, so that people could find the scholars who still had to make their payments. And of course, Leolus saw the perils in this as well, and Amber as well. She said, well, is all this data even available? I don't even know about all this data. She asked Leolus. Furthermore, how will we change these 3 REST, SOAP, RPC code into one single front-end component, made of gold even? Amber could already see herself getting flashback to her previous adventure, where she ended up in callback hell. And I mean, even though the services she was calling and all the products she was using were wrapped in tight little interfaces like the course system and the student system, still it was an ugly piece of code. Well, Leolus came over and said, of course it's not going to be easy, but there has to be a better way than this callback hell. And so Amber and Leolus went on with their journey, and they continued their journey towards the other side of the mountain, the back end of the mountain, if you will. But instead of taking the high road, they took the low road, and they went into the dark caverns. It's a place where the data miners with their deep learning machinery lurked. And when they went as far in the cave as they could, it was flooding with water and they could get no further. And lo and behold, they went as far as they could and they stumbled upon a warlock guarding the ferries that would take them even further. And this warlock had a strange evil in its eye. It was Merrick, warlock, gatekeeper and backend engineer of the arcane ages. And Warwick said, sure, I can build you an endpoint, he snarled with joy. But it sure won't be pretty, he said. It will hardly be restful, and you'll never know for sure in what format it will respond to you. I could do all sorts of things. I could maybe hide this data inside another course's endpoint, and maybe pass a little parameter to say that's what data is true. But of course, then the core system would have to query all these other systems, and it would get really messy, and the core system was not made for it. Well, Merrick said, or perhaps create a little dashboard endpoint, I'll just create it separately, and I'll create multiple parameters that you can specify which data you want to get back. But of course, this data that would be returned would be enormous, and it would only work for the single interface. Well then, if your mobile friends come around, I might even add a filter. And he plucked one more parameter to the REST endpoint that says filter is mobile. And we all know, of course, these fields would get reduced. But how, for instance, will someone ever paginate the embedded data inside an endpoint? You would have no clue, and you would just have to figure it out later. And Amber was surprised by this, and he asked the question, but you will write us some documentation, right? Hoping that Merrick would fulfill an old oath made by the backend race long time ago. To which Merrick said, well, I guess you have to figure that out later when I'm done, and we'll meet again. And he sailed off, snarling and with snoring and laughter, mumbling something about a deadline that no one could really understand. And so, Emmer and Leolis sat for a while, contemplating the end of their journey. Alright, so Leolis said, we could still cancel the project, he muttered, but he knew it would be a super hard story to sell when he got back home to the village. And Emmer said, no, we'll just have to look further. We're not done. And they left this dreadful cave for what it was. And so they went outside, and their thick mist had filled the valley. It was dead silent, apart from this loud metallic noise that it would, quite like a hammer on an anvil. And so they approached the rocks. Do you hear that? Leolis said. It must be a dwarf forging some new tech. And their enthusiasm was sparked. And so they were approaching this rock. And they went closer and closer, and the sound got louder and louder. And when they were so close, they peeked around the corner, and sure, it was a dwarf. His name was Grodry. He was a dwarven wise man and a GitHub stargazer. Giddying with glee over the new tech that he forged, and he was so happy he could not wait to share it with them. Just look at this GraphQL API language I forged, Grodry said. Every frontend can write its own query for exactly the data they need from the API. It's quite a promise to make. So instead of creating a REST endpoint, you would have one endpoint, which would be GraphQL, Grodry said, and you would specify exactly which fields they need. So for instance, we get some locations, we get some courses. From these courses, we see the students, and from these courses, we also want to see which payments would be made. So we specify this query, we send it over to the server, and we get back this response containing exactly the data we need to fill our magic component. Well, Emmer was of course super excited. She said, that query looks quite elaborate. How will I find out which fields I can actually use? So Grodry said, well, try the hammer of GraphQL. It was actually the thing that was making this awful sound. It's one with the API, like the blade is to the hilt of a sword. And so they sat down and they took a look at graphical, which is the visual interface for GraphQL that comes with every of the GraphQL endpoints. Let's see if we can find some data inside the system, okay? So we got this query over here, and we autocomplete using Control Spacebar, and we can see exactly which data is available. So we're going to query for some course materials. And we see that we set the limit to 1, we press the play button on the top, we specify the name, and we get back exactly 1 course material. We go on, we see if we can find some locations, and even supply the search text. We're going to search for locations in Mordor. And of course we want to know the address, because otherwise we will never know how we can get there. Well, it looks as there's no locations in Mordor, so we'll just skip over that one for a second. We're going to see if we can get some more information on the groups that are actually being taught something. So you can see we have the groups over here. We limit it to 3 groups. We see if we can get the date when the group actually started their courses. We see if we can get some information, the learning users, the people that are actually using, are actually participating in the course. And from this user, we want to find the ID. And let's see. We can see that the data on the right side is exactly the data that we requested on the left side. All right. Emmer said, but what about making changes to this data? We don't only want to query, sometimes we also want to change something, like we used to do with posts and puts. Well, you can explore these queries in a similar manner, Grodry said. And of course, we'll have to strictly define how we supply this input. So quite like the queries, we can also change the data with mutations. So we're going to create one of the course materials now. So we specify this query or this mutation. So as course material create, and we have to pass it some data, of course, we're going to create something new. And we immediately specify that once the object is created, we get back only the name of the course material. And now we pass the data on top, so we have to specify which inputs we're giving to the system. And then we autocomplete this as well, and it will be the course material input type. So the system actually knows what kind of data we need to pass. And of course, we did not specify the variables yet, so we send them separately. Course material, we actually have a name. We add this name. How to tame a dragon would seem appropriate, right? So we send this mutation along. We actually see the error message on the top right, like very specified on the field level, which is great for front-end developers. And now we've fixed the line. We actually added the course material. But I digress. And Grote was so happy. He said, "You don't even have to update the documentation ever again. All the inputs and outputs into this GraphQL API are defined in code, which means that this documentation is dynamically generated. You can even go through it to explore what is actually available." So like we saw before, we have a button on the top right. We look over there, we can see the course materials, exactly the parameters that we can feed this method, and we can see what it returns. It's the type of string. Everything is strongly typed. For instance, if we have exams, and we need to give it an exam type, we can even see the level, which is an enumeration of multiple values. You can actually see which values are available, so you never have to guess again which values you send to the backend. And the same thing goes for the mutations as well. So it's an elaborate list of everything that's possible within this API. All right. So that's super convenient. So we just create these queries and copy-paste them inside our code. Well, if we look at a way how we implement this in the front end, like the super simplest way, Grote said, because I don't want to make it too complicated, is that we define this query. It's just a string literal over here. We create an AJAX request using the fetch API to this endpoint. You make sure to specify that it's a post, because it's always a post. You say that you want to return some JSON. And then we create the body of this call that's being made, which is the query that we specified earlier, and the variables that we're sending along. And then we get the data back in the JSON object, as you have seen before. But we can go even further, Grote said. If using the enchantment of Apollo gets you loading, caching, refetching powers even. So in a little bit more advanced example, we can see we use GraphQL tag over here to define the query, which helps your IDE understand that you're writing GraphQL and will help you autocomplete it. We use React Apollo, so we create this query component, and when we're creating our course materials list, we wrap our usual component inside a query component. We'll take care of getting all this data. So we just get a very convenient loading an error state and add the actual data so we can render it inside our other components without worrying about all the data management. And for even the most advanced of sorcerers, Grote said, GraphQL even supports real-time data, which he was a great fan of. So the front end, you describe a subscription. You can see this on top instead of a query or a mutation. You say a subscription. And for instance, we could have real-time data coming in, quite like the IoT presentation that Stephanie gave earlier, where they used MQTT to transfer these points. But then it would be through a WebSocket or MQTT. You can choose your transport layer yourself. But in this case, we're looking at payments that are created. So we created an interface where we use this query result. I won't go into complete details there, but then in the mount function of your component, you can subscribe to events coming from the server. So every time someone makes a payment, the update query is called, and you can process this incoming payment. Well, that sounds like exactly the magic we need. Will you join us on our quest, Rotary? They could of course use such a smart dwarf. And Rotary happily agreed. And so they started their journey back. The evening was falling. You can see there a lovely skyline. As you could see the application landscape in the distance. But they still had a long way to go before they could actually start reworking the infrastructure there. And it was getting dark, and all of a sudden they saw a shadow lurking out from the darkness. And lo and behold, it was Merrick, who had returned from the caves and heard the rumors about his new tech. Well, that's nice and all, but I'm not having any of them JavaScripts on my backends. To which Amber replied, well, it can be any language, Merrick. It doesn't have to be JavaScript. I mean, the examples on internet are usually in JavaScript, but it could be anything. But he wasn't finished yet. So Merrick said, well, what about security? We had all this perfect security. To which Rotary had made a remark. Well, you can authorize this data on the field level. So on every field that you specify, you can create your own authorization. And you can even make sure that you only allow queries that are built by legitimate front end. So you could not just have anyone thinking of any query they would want. But he was still not convinced. Merrick said, well, HTTP had the perfect cache game going on, and you're going to ruin it. Layla said, well, you're right, you lose the HTTP cache. But I mean, you can cache on different levels. You can cache within the resolvers, and you can even cache on the client itself to make sure that you don't get the same data over and over again. And Rotary said, you know what? Let's just dive in, and you will see for yourself. And so Rotary stepped up, and he summoned his device. And he bashed the git clone commands on the most rugged keyboard that would endure the dwarf's mighty keystrokes. So he was building this backend field resolver. Now bear with me, we go into Node.js a little bit because it's Rotary's favorite language. So we created this course materials endpoint. And there's a couple of things that are important. You need to specify a type, which would specify how the data is going to look when you call this API. You specify the arguments that the client can post to the server, and you have a resolve function that will actually get this data. So we specify these GraphQL ints, these GraphQL strings, exactly how the parameters would look like. Now with special attention to the course material type, this will be the type that will be returned by the resolver in the end, and will look something like this in a different file, where you just specify it as an ID and a name. It's not that difficult a component. And then at the end, you would have this resolve function that was being called when the client queries this field. And here, we translate the arguments into the database column that's being created, like a cursor. And we find this course material, and we return it, and we make sure that it looks like we specified in the type. And of course, this example is in Node.js, but you can find libraries for C#, for Java, for Python, and even PHP has its own GraphQL community creating endpoints for this API language. And so Merrick said, well, that is quite interesting. Merrick thought it was going to be a lot more work. And GraphQL doesn't need to replace REST everywhere, but it could improve the discovery and the usage of our API's data. And so they agreed to disagree, and decided that to give this wondrous, magical tech a try. And so they ventured back through the marshes, where you could already see that some of the leaves were getting more color while they were talking and walking. Their discussion started to blossom, as if things were actually not as rigid as they thought they was before. And so, filled with enthusiasm, magic powers, and good spirits, the fellowship returned to the business at the bottom of the mountain. So remember the systems that we had in place? Well, Rotary started by creating an integration layer that would actually aggregate all of the different systems. And if we look back to the example that we had before, we had this resolve method and we access the database directly. But it could just as easily be an SDK that you would include, like the Twinfield one over here for the bookkeeping system. Or you might even venture into the old SOAP systems that were like on the address of http/mordor/soap. It doesn't matter as long as the return type would actually contain, you would create the same data that you specified in the return type. So Grory created this integration layer in L as well, and now Amber was able to create her interface that would talk directly to the GraphQL layer. And of course it was made of gold, and the users really liked it. In the end, what happened to Leolus? Well, let's say that the other application and mobile teams enjoyed this flexible access to this data as much as Amber did. Thank you. All right, and maybe a little extra if you want to get started with GraphQL. There's this tutorial that's online for free by Prisma. It's called howtographql.com, so you can use this for free. Wes Bos actually released a course, I think 1 week ago, that's called Advanced React, and it actually shows you a full stack application with GraphQL in the backend and React in the front end. Yeah. All right.
So good. Okay, thanks a lot. Wow.